My mother and father fell in love when they were teenagers, and my mother got pregnant before they were married, and they ran off together and got married in another state. But by the time that I was born, they had already had some difficulties, and my mother had decided to leave. So when I was about 2 weeks old, my mother took me and left my father and moved back to Texas. When I was still very young, before my first birthday, my mother married her second husband, who was my stepfather. But because they had married when I was so young, I just always thought he was my dad. When I was about 4 years old, they had my little sister. And I really didn't know just how perfect my life was. But I had a mom and a dad and a baby sister and my own room and a bike and friends at school. We lived in a nice house, and there was no violence, and plenty of food to eat, and holiday celebrations. And then one day my mother told me that my stepfather was not my dad, and that I wasn't going to be able to see him anymore. That he had taken my baby sister, and he was divorcing my mother, and that I wasn't going to see either one of them anymore. My mother moved us in with her new boyfriend, and he was so different. He was much younger and an alcoholic, and he behaved very immaturely, very adolescent. Things were very violent. He had moved us into a condemned trailer house, and the kids in that town had all grown up together. So I was suddenly the new kid, and because I was not her boyfriend's child, he would not provide anything for me. And I didn't have new clothes for the school year that year. I can't remember where my mom got the clothes for me, but they were, they were not nice. They were, they didn't fit me properly, and they weren't new, and they weren't all in good repair. So needless to say, the kids were very cruel. And at home, so was her boyfriend. So I felt very rejected and alone, both at school and at this house that had become my home, even though it didn't seem like a home. And then my mother sent me to go stay with my cousins for the summer. I had been put in the car with an uncle that I did not know, an older man. He was my grandmother's brother, to go to a neighboring town to my aunt's at night. It was about a 1-hour drive, but he did not drive me directly there. He pulled over on the side of the road and he molested me. So then I had this really dark secret that I couldn't really make sense out of. And I just had nothing in the way of support or any kind of stability. I went back to my mother's house and it was just very hard. They fought a lot, and when they weren't fighting, they were very openly affectionate. And that was very different from how she had been with my stepfather, whom I believed for years was my dad. So my life just completely changed, and the school bus, it didn't come out to where we lived. And so I walked to school, and I was not put in any kind of extracurricular activities, no sports or anything like that. And, so there just wasn't much opportunity for me to bond with the other kids. They had all grown up together, and I was this outsider. And, I was an outsider at my house, and I was an outsider at school. And, the things that would normally allow children to bond with other children were just not in place for me. My mother and her boyfriend were atheists, and in these small towns in the Bible Belt, everybody else was Christian. The people in town knew that my mother had been married multiple times and that the man that she was with was not her husband. And so, these very conservative families were not welcoming to me. And by the age of 8 years old, I had decided to kill myself. And I had a great plan. I had planned to end my life on one particular day. And I remember going home that day after school, and I felt so free and so incredibly happy. The day hadn't been any easier than any other day. I had been bullied on the playground just like any other day, and I had sat hungry in the lunchroom watching the other kids eat just like any other day. But this day was different because it was going to be the last day that I would ever have to suffer any of it. And when I got home, I tossed my bag on the floor and I walked directly to my my mother's bedroom, because that's where they kept a loaded shotgun. I took the shotgun and I sat down on the sofa and I put it in my mouth. And then I ran into a problem that I had not foreseen. I was too short. I couldn't keep the gun in my mouth and reach the trigger. I tried several different ways to get it to work, and I just wasn't big enough, and I just hadn't considered that. I knew how the gun worked and that it was loaded and what to do, and now, right at this last minute, I could not get it to work. I was failing at even this. And I started to panic. I started to imagine trying to fall asleep, thinking about all the things I couldn't talk about. And then waking up just to go back to school and face those kids again. And I just couldn't imagine having to do it all again. I wanted it to end, and I needed it to end that day. And I just started searching this house and this property for some other way to die. But I couldn't find any way to do it. We lived out around all these little short mesquite trees, and this was just a tiny little condemned trailer house. There was no traffic for me to fling myself into, no bridge or tall building for me to jump off of. There was just nothing available to me there. And I just began to hysterically cry and scream, and I was screaming, no, it has to end today. It has to end today. And then my knees buckled and I fell to the ground, and I was just crying uncontrollably. And then all of a sudden, this presence filled the room. And I could feel this immense feeling that I only know to describe as love. And it filled me and also surrounded me at the same time. And then I heard this voice of spirit very clearly say, I know your life is hard, but I love you. In this moment, I knew innately that this was my Creator. And he said, if you will just make it through this season, I'm going to give you a life beyond anything you can imagine. And so I considered what he was saying, and I imagined facing all the same things, but not facing them alone. You see, God didn't tell me that my life was going to get easier. He just said that he was going to walk through it with me, and that there was going to be something good on the other side of all the pain. He just said it was going to be worth it. And so I considered what he was proposing, and finally I said, okay, but don't let go. Don't ever let go. And that day I began a journey with God, one that continues even now as I make this recording.